Good evening and welcome to City Limits. My name's Norm McCourt, your host of City Limits, the show that provides you with information about the people, places, and events that shape the character of our community. Joining me tonight will be Tim Fischesser, longtime guest here on the show, and Tim is the Executive Director of the St. Louis County Municipal League. As I mentioned, joining me now is Tim Fischesser, Executive Director of St. Louis County Municipal League. Welcome, Tim.
Well, thank you, Norm. It's great to be back on the show again.
Hey, you're always a wealth of knowledge when you come on the show, especially with what's going on in Jefferson City. I don't think too many people know what's going on in Jefferson City. Maybe even the people up there don't know what's happening.
Well, you know, with the term limits, so many people have less experience. And you can imagine there's about 200 state senators and state reps. Well, if you had a company with 200 employees and you said, you know, it's really going to be tough to have any of you work here more than 8 years, or you got to get promoted to the Senate, for example. So you don't have very many people that have very much experience. So a lot of that institutional knowledge is not there any longer. So don't really understand why some of the laws were created the way they were created, or how some of the laws relate to some other laws and stuff. So that loss of institutional knowledge is a big change from what it was 15 years or so ago.
And even if they made a change from term limits now, it would take years and years to build up institutional knowledge again.
Yeah. And I think voters, I understand why voters want term limits. They don't want somebody to become so powerful that they control things and can never leave the office almost because the amount of power they've accumulated. Now, voters could send them packing and replace them with somebody, but trying to find the right balance of trying to get new blood in there, but still preserving some of the best legislative minds with a lot of institutional history would be interesting to see if there would be some way you could mix those two together and get a little better result.
I know the St. Louis County Municipal League and the Missouri Municipal League for the last several years have tried to get term limits increased, which would, alleviate some of that, but it's still, there still would be knowledge leaving there when somebody is termed out.
Yeah, no, it's what we've thought maybe if right now you can spend 8 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate. Not very many people do both. We said, well, what if you could spend a total of 16 years in either body? Then you could stay in the House or the Senate for a longer period of time and pick up some of that institutional knowledge that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. And it's not only the knowledge, the institutional knowledge, it's the knowledge of how the laws are written, because a lot of them now, when they pass the laws, they don't pass muster when they go to court. And that presents a real problem too.
It is. We run into that so often, and it ends up that a municipality or a county or a school district or something like that will file suit. And it's not so much that the underlying law is so disagreeable, but there's no instructions on how to apply the law. So then the various departments are allowed to write the code for the state of Missouri that implements the laws, but those may not be very close to what everybody thought was the original legislative intent of the bill. So the bill didn't have enough information in it to really give us much direction. And so it's easy then to violate the law accidentally. And I think you're right, when there was more institutional knowledge, that didn't happen as often.
Yeah, the one that's always interesting to me is that there is a state law that each bill has to reflect a particular topic, and it can't be two topics, it has to be one topic. And they constantly, laws are passed up there that contain two topics, and goes to court, it's thrown out.
That happened with a lot of telecommunication issues 2 years ago, and the law was taken to court, and the court threw it out, and then they came back with 4 different bills the following year and did it properly. But sometimes when people suggest, you're really putting too many subjects into one bill and violating the Constitution, sometimes people just kind of say, well, let's just see if it gets challenged. And then it does, and then you got to start over again. And so it's
keeps a lot of lawyers employed.
Yeah, it can be frustrating because everybody could do a little better job if they tried. The problem is if they only, besides the budget bills, they only pass maybe 125 bills, but thousands are introduced. So if your bill looks like it's not going to pass, then what you want to do is try to put it onto another bill So it will pass, and that's when they start mixing too many subjects in one bill and run into constitutional problems.
Oh, okay. Makes sense, but you know.
You can kind of see
kinda-
why you're desperate to get your bill passed, so you do desperate things, and then it ends up falling apart eventually in court.
And most of the bills on the passage is like the last week or two anyway, isn't it? When they start really trying to get everything through because they know the session's going to end.
Yeah, a bill, of course, has to start in a committee in one chamber and then go through that chamber. That's hearings in different committees. The speaker or the president pro tem has to put it on the calendar, and then there's floor debate. Then you got to repeat it in the next chamber. And so it's not easy to pass a bill. And that's why part of the reason is it gets backlogged toward the end of session. But the other reason is just the process has a lot of steps in it. And to get enough interest by your other peers that are in your particular chamber, and the Republicans may not agree with the Democrats, or the governor may oppose or support something, and so there's the normal give and take that takes a while to get things through.
Mm-hmm. Let's assume I introduced a bill. On the average, how long does it take? Let's assume that bill passes eventually. How long does it take to get that bill through the House and the Senate? I mean, it's not, a lot of them are not 1 year process, I think. It's like 2 and 3 and 4
Well, like
year
I said,
processes.
less than 10% of the bills pass. And so, sometimes it means 10 years or sometimes it means never, if there's just not enough support for it in both chambers. And, with the party in charge has a lot to say, about which bills are going to pass. It's pretty rare that the minority party has any bills pass. Now, every once in a while, that's not the case, but usually if it's a democratically controlled House, most of the bills that are going to pass the House are going to be bills that are sponsored by Democrats, and vice versa with Republicans. So an awful lot of bills just never see the light of day once they're filed. They don't even get a hearing. And there's the ones that do get a hearing, but the committee doesn't take them very seriously. And the chairman of the committee has a limited number of bills that they're allowed to pass forward to leadership to put on the calendar. So it's a torturous process. A good bill, it's not unusual for a good bill to take 2 or 3 years to pass because there's other bills kind of ahead of them, you might say. Unless it's some sort of really important emergency or maybe a major ideological issue or something that the majority party wants to get passed. But I would say, don't plan on just an average, reasonably good bill to pass a couple years, probably.
Mm-hmm. Even when they get the bills up there, you might start with one group of House of Representatives. Senate's pretty good because it got a longer term, but the House turns over quite a bit. So when you come back to the second year, you're educating about a third of the House again.
Well, that's true. And sometimes it's the same person who's chairing that committee, but once they get to their 8-year term limit, they're out. And some of them leave earlier than that because maybe they leave after 6 years because they know they're getting close to the end of their term. So you have a new chairman of the committee, and that new chairman may have different allegiances or different interests than the previous chairman. So you're right. The bills may be all jumbled up again as to where they were kind of in the priority list.
Yeah, and the dynamics up there is interesting also in that, we think of Republican, Democrat, but they also have urban, rural up there, which, have a lot of different wants, and, the rural areas of the rural areas of Missouri want different things than the urban areas do.
No, there are a lot of subgroups, and the committees can sometimes sort through those a little bit. Sometimes there's an urban issues committee that may deal, or more the agricultural committee deal with some of the rural issues. But when it comes to something that affects all of us across the state, like school funding, there maybe the rural areas feel like they're not getting enough out of the school formula. Maybe the urban areas feel the same way, and so there's this back and forth about, well, if you're going to be paying the taxes in my area, why isn't my area getting more of the money back? And it's eventually you hope that everybody has enough statesmanship to figure out a way to raise the tide for all the ships in the harbor so there's enough education money to help all Missouri kids get a good education and strengthen our economy and build the next generation. But every once in a while, it does break down into that urban-rural rift, and that can be a significant problem with some bills.
Yeah, the experience I've had up there is, that in some cases even more difficult to overcome than the Republican-Democrat type issue.
Well, it can be, and part of that formula that kind of comes into play is in the urban areas, we have people living together, closer together, so you have a more robust tax base kind of per square mile. So, for example, in St. Louis County, we're passed a tax to build a new communication system for all our police and firemen. But if you go into rural areas, they would have to have a much higher tax to do the same thing. So they sometimes will say, well, let's have a statewide tax, and then some of the urban areas can subsidize some of the rural areas by this new tax because they would claim they don't have enough tax base correctly in the rural areas. So then we have to put our heads together and see if there's some fair way we can come together to try to address a problem across the state. And it's not easy. Sometimes say, well, we're willing to share a little bit, but we also want to make sure our needs are met. So you have some give and take. And sometimes other people say, well, we don't think you should share at all. Or maybe the rural areas don't want the tax. So even though they might get a little bit more from the urban areas, they just may not want to even put in their fair share. So there's a lot of dynamics that go on in that. And that's really, when I mention something that you lose when you have term limits, not all, but a lot of those longer term legislators, there was enough trust among them where they could sit down together and they could begin to work out some of those things. And it helps a lot when you've known somebody for 10 or 15 or 20 years and served with them. Just like, a lot of us have in St. Louis County. You just end up trusting people when you've been around them for a long time. And it doesn't happen in the legislature quite as often where, people just haven't served that long. There's not that trust there. So they don't come to solutions quite as easily, I don't think.
Yeah, it's quite unusual dynamics for sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the municipal bills that are up there. What's some of the things that the legislator is looking at this year?
Well, there's a lot of bills that have been filed because of the various police actions and rioting and so forth around the region and actually around the country. So that's probably the biggest number of new bills. Some have to do, I kind of break them down into three areas. Some have to do with the municipal courts, and some of them have to do with municipal police activities per se, and whether there's a way that we could have some different standards for police or some different training or some things like that. On the courts, it's a way, is there a way to streamline things? Is there a way to make it clear to people who get tickets on the types of things that are important to them? And then kind of the third area is best practices all around. That if cities that are not doing so well, if they're not doing so well financially and they're relying too much on the courts, is there some way they can improve their performance in other ways? They may have to look to their neighbors to join with contracting with services, things like that. So I think a lot of the bills this year have to do with that, the courts, local police, and the best practices.
A lot of the bills they have it appears that they would materially affect the finances of a lot of cities. Not only the courts ones, I think they have a committee that's looking into the sales tax and how the sales taxes are distributed. And I think they have a bill on that.
Yeah, a bill was just filed last week that would change the sales tax distribution by allowing anybody to keep at least half the money that's generated from their stores. We have a situation in St. Louis County where part of the county that was originally had sales taxes defined as the A part of the county, and they're partially grandfathered, and then the rest of the county is what we call the B area, and they share all their sales tax from a 1-cent sales tax. But some of those B areas have a lot of stores in them, so some feel like, well, they ought to be able to keep more of that money in those areas and not share as much with the rest in the B areas. So that's always been a thorn of contention. There's been a report that Dr. Brassfield from Webster University was asked to develop that would outline some options what would happen if you did this, what would happen if you did that, what would happen if you would do a third alternative. And his report explains some of those things pretty well to see what would happen. But the big problem is that since the recession in 2008, the sales tax pie shrunk. It's just slowly expanded to about where it was 7 years ago. So there really hasn't been any new money coming forward for about 7 years. So it's difficult then for somebody to say, well, here in blackjack, your piece is going to be a little smaller, so my piece can be a little bigger. And that's not easy to do, especially with a pie that is not growing. So we're all struggling to pay our increased costs for employees and health care and cost of concrete and asphalt and general city operations. So it's not very easy to say, would you mind having a little smaller piece of the pie?
Yeah, well, some of the ways that cities developed and were built, it makes it real difficult. In particularly our case, we have very little retail, and there's no way of getting a lot of retail. And most of North County is pretty much that way. There's some retail, but it's not a lot as compared to South and West County.
Yeah, there's been I don't have a study that would prove this, but I think if somebody ran the numbers, it would show that probably the wealth in St. Louis City and St. Louis County tends to be in a large central corridor, kind of from I-44 on the south, coming up maybe to Delmar, or maybe I-70 on the north, various different places. And it seems to have been more concentration there. If you look, for example, just at the major malls that have closed in St. Louis County the last 25 years, you start with Jamestown and you go through the two in Jennings and then St. Anne, but also down in Crestwood. Crestwood Mall's closed and stuff. So it's happening as St. Louis County's gotten older and as sprawl has occurred in the region, that more assets have relocated, and that means the tax base is struggling more in some areas.
Yeah, and it's pretty hard to, replace that taxes. I mean, there's only a limited amount of money you can bring in, and it's pretty much based by statute. You can only do certain things based on the type of city you are.
For schools, of course, the state puts in a lot of money into the K-12 system, so the state helps equalize it a little bit. Still not a full funded formula at the state level, so there's still a lot of areas that don't have as much money behind each student as other areas. When it comes to cities, we created this law years ago where the sales tax is partially shared, so that helps cities a little bit. But you get into fire districts and some of the other districts, there's no pooling arrangement for any of them to kind of spread out the demands and the wealth a little bit around the county. So it can be it's a significant problem everywhere to some degree, and in some services even to a higher degree, where there's no pool to rely on or state government to help with some sort of revenue sharing from the state down to the locals.
Right. Well, one of the things that would help, and I don't know if I did not see a pre-file on it, but I assume they pre-filed it this year, was an internet sales tax. That would really help, to kind of equalize things and also help the local businesses, because they're losing out a lot to, these internet storefronts.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's ever proposed that it be a new tax, but just the same tax that applies to goods that you purchase in a store should apply to goods that you purchase on the internet. And the bill's been introduced the last several years, and it fails to get real strong support. Most people seem to think, that would be fair, but then they don't want to vote for any type of tax increase, even if it would level the playing field. And it's frustrating because that puts a burden on our local stores. So it doesn't make sense to us to have the local entrepreneurs be hurt because they have to collect a tax that their competitors on the internet do not have to collect. And you would think that would be resolved more easily, but another one of the dynamics in Jefferson City that just results in it not being solved.
Yeah, well, hopefully they'll see the light and do something. That's been in the mill for the last couple of years.
Absolutely, yeah.
The other thing is what's happening with red light cameras and speed cameras.
Well, there's always been bills introduced on those too, but those cases are now before the Supreme Court, and I think that most people are waiting to see what the Supreme Court says about them. If the Supreme Court says the rules are unconstitutional, even though they're lighter penalties than if you get caught by a policeman or policewoman in person, if the court determines they're not equal enough, even though the person that gets the camera ticket doesn't get the points and probably not going to suffer higher car insurance rates and so forth. And you can see the video to see if you were wrong or not. And, if you weren't wrong, you can easily appeal that, if you.
I think the one I got caught on, I think they painted the red dot on.
Yeah. I know I've talked to a few people about them, and in a couple of cases they asked me, I said, well, did you look at the video? And they said, no, I didn't get online and look at the video of my violation. And I'd say, well, let's get online, but they got to put in their special code for that. And so we'd look at it and they say, yeah, I guess I was just in a hurry that day, and I could have stopped for that, but I was trying to stretch, hoping that yellow light wouldn't turn red, and it turned red and stuff like that. Now, every once in a while, some of those violations may or may not be unsafe if it's really close to that red-yellow line when the light changes, but we do have some very serious accidents from people who go into intersections that shouldn't on a red light, and that's so unfortunate. But we'll have to see what the Supreme Court says, I think, to see if there's any bills that will get some legs behind them this year.
Okay. What about property maintenance? Is there any bills that, especially rental property, where you can't get a hold of the owner or whatever to have them fix the property, and the renters certainly are not going to?
Yeah, that's been a real struggle. The landlords are a pretty powerful group and would prefer to have things limited. Now, it gets a little complicated. We have some cities that are called charter cities, where people within a city can actually adopt a charter or constitution, and they have a little more authority to do those sorts of things. But for statutory cities like Blackjack, that are third or fourth class cities typically, or in villages, they're only allowed to do what the legislature has put in the statutes books that are permissible. Mm-hmm. So the statutory cities would like to adopt some of the same laws that the charter cities have, but we have to put them in the statutes first before the local city can pass an ordinance to do that. And that's been an effort that's been ongoing, and I think there's a greater recognition among legislators that they should look into that, because once the property starts going downhill, that's when you have a lot of the problems. I mean, you have concentrations of low-income people, you have higher crime, you have more poverty, and if we could keep those buildings in better shape, that would be one more little way to try to stop a community from sliding downhill.
Okay, well, let's take a break here, and
Sure.
We'll pick up here in a minute with a special surprise for our audience. Welcome back to our show. Joining me now is Tim's lovely wife, Jeannie.
Hi, Norm.
Fisher.
How are you?
Hi,
Good to
I'm
see
doing
you
great.
again.
Well, I'm sure the people at the Municipal League know, but we had some, I guess I'd call it bad news. Tim decided to retire this year. And they were lucky enough to talk him into not retiring full-time, but working some part-time. But, when you have somebody that's been in that position for, heck, as long as I can remember, 20 some odd years?
Almost 25 years.
Yeah,
huh?
25 years. You have a lot of institutional knowledge, to use a word from our earlier part of this show, that's going to be missing there. And Tim has been a great, great, great person with a wealth of knowledge that's helped us all many, 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 many times. I know I've went to him a lot of times, and he helped train me, actually. So it's going to be missed. What are some of your thoughts, Tim?
Well, fortunately, Steve, who's been our deputy director for years, has been there for 30 years, and he's just a storehouse of great knowledge, too. So we're very fortunate to have Steve there. And I'm certainly happy to help out in any way I can as we make the transition. But all of us someday are going to have to face it and think about when's the right time to retire and enjoy a little more free time and things like that. So I'm looking forward to the combination, and I'm sure there'll be times more than once when Jeannie will say, "Isn't there something you have to do today?"
Yeah, I was just going to ask you,
If you can
what's
think
your
of it,
thoughts on
Norm,
this?
just send me an email, will you?
What are you looking forward to Tim being home all the time?
Well, I really am. I myself have recently thought about retirement from the job I've had for over 35 years. I'm a nurse practitioner. And, to be able to have our age and health and things to look forward to together is just an absolute wonderful thing in terms of our future. So, as he said, I'm sure we're going to have to find time to have a little time to ourselves, but it really has become just an absolute joy to think about spending these next years together.
They had the, we'll say, retirement party for you at the last St. Louis County Municipal League, and it was absolutely outstanding hearing you both talk and how you're looking forward to it and how much you just relate to each other. It's just great. Really
we
great.
actually met when we were teenagers and have been together ever since. So it's been a long time. And we both have worked over 40 years and stuff like that. So when we started to give it serious thought, 6-7 months ago about, well, when are we going to try to spend more time together? You don't want to wait until you're too old or unhealthy or something like that. So it just seemed like the time was right. And today's actually my first day of kind of semi-retirement. We had a nice time going out looking at some bald eagles in the Alton area before coming by here for the show, and just a relaxing day.
Well, that's a good thing. Give you a chance to get out and get out. Let me put one word in your mind about it. World travel. That's always fun.
Yep.
It's an absolute pleasure to be able to think about having time to do that. I myself am Italian. Tim's taken me on several trips into Europe to go to Italy, and we've seen some beautiful sights and spent time with dear friends who spend time over there. And we have a lot to look toward. I mean, we have our own new calendar of vacation plans and things to do with our children and our beautiful little grandson. So I think it's going to be an absolute joy. And I've been smiling ever since the retirement party, as you saw me, Norm. But it's just an absolute wonderful feeling to know the years that we dedicated ourselves to all the work that each of us have done and shared and met so many wonderful, dedicated people like you, for example, who I would have never been able to cross paths with, who have really given us a lot to look toward. So we're really looking forward to it.
Well, great. Well, as we go to wrap up here, I'll start with you, Jeannie. Where did you go to high school? I always ask everybody that question.
Well, funny you should ask, because I'm probably one person here, not him. I'm a Parkway West Longhorn.
Oh, okay.
From the class of 72.
Very good. Tim, how about you?
And I actually graduated from a high school called St. Xavier in Cincinnati.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure, and as you noticed, I kind of stumbled when I went into this introduction at the very beginning there when I was introducing Jeannie, because we are going to miss you. And I really have. It's really been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Norm.
Really a pleasure.
Right back at you.
Norm, I hope that we can continue to cross paths with all the wonderful people like you who work so hard for your communities. It really means a lot.
That's a nice thing about
thank
being
you.
semi-retired and not cold turkey retired.
There you go. Well, I hope our paths cross many times in the future.
Okay. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Once again, we'd like to thank Tim Fischesser for coming on the show tonight and for being a frequent guest on the show to provide us with a lot of information on what's going on in Jeff City. Thank you for watching this evening. If you have any questions for me, you can contact me at www.cityofblackjack.com, or you can call me at area code 314-355-0400. Good evening.